In the rural parishes of 19th-century Louisiana, there existed a medical diagnosis known as drapetomania, a supposed mental illness that caused enslaved people to flee captivity. It was a formal, clinical term for a human being's desire for freedom, treating the natural impulse to escape bondage as a form of madness to be cured. This clinical detachment, this twisting of suffering into pathology, created a world where the truly unspeakable could hide in plain sight, veiled by the language of order and propriety. In this world, a man's property was his kingdom, and what happened within its borders was subject to no law but his own. The Vance Plantation, a sprawling sugar cane empire carved from the sweltering wetlands west of the Mississippi, was one such kingdom. And in the summer of 1848, its foundations began to crack, not from an overt rebellion but from a silence that grew in the heart of the great house itself. It started with a sound, or the lack of it, a stillness in rooms that were once filled with the rustle of silk and quiet commands, a silence that clung to the air like the humid summer fog, sound of a single, heavy floorboard creaking upstairs, followed by profound silence. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Elias Vance was a man forged from discipline and ambition. His grandfather had acquired the land with a Spanish grant, and his father had bled it for every ounce of indigo it could produce. Elias, however, had turned to sugar, a crop that demanded a different kind of ruthlessness, a relentless industrial precision. His plantation, Belle Rêve, or Beautiful Dream, was a testament to this obsession with control. The cane grew in perfectly straight lines, the slave quarters were arranged in a stark, efficient grid, and the great house itself was a monument to symmetrical Georgian architecture. Elias believed that order was the only thing separating civilization from the swamp that constantly threatened to reclaim his land. He was 42 years old, respected in the parish, a man whose word was as solid as the cypress wood that framed his home. But for all his wealth and power, he was a king without an heir. His wife, Seraphina, had failed to produce a child in 10 years of marriage. Each month that passed was a quiet judgment, a crack in the perfect facade of his dynasty. It was a failure he could not tolerate, a disorder in the grand design of his life, and it was beginning to curdle his ambition into a quiet, simmering rage that he kept hidden behind a veneer of genteel control. Seraphina Vance was as delicate and ornamental as the French porcelain she collected. She had been brought from Charleston to be the mistress of Belle Rêve, a beautiful, pale flower meant to adorn Elias' world. But the Louisiana heat, the oppressive humidity, and the profound isolation had wilted her. The house, for all its grandeur, was a gilded cage. Her days were a silent, repeating pattern of managing the household staff, staring out at the endless rows of cane, and enduring her husband's cold disappointment each night. Her barrenness was her defining feature, a brand of shame that she felt in the pitying glances of other plantation wives and in the sterile silence of her own womb. Then, in the spring of 1848, a new slave arrived, part of a lot purchased from a trader in New Orleans. Her name was Morwen. She was unlike anyone Seraphina had ever seen. She was immense, not with fat but with a towering height and broad, powerful shoulders that spoke of a strength beyond mere muscle. Her skin was the color of dark river soil, and her face was marked with fine, intricate scars that traced patterns across her cheeks. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. She was assigned to the house, and a strange, unspoken gravity began to pull the fragile mistress and the silent giant into a shared orbit. Elias noticed the change in his wife almost immediately, though he couldn't name it. Seraphina, who had been drifting through her days like a ghost, seemed to find a new, quiet purpose. She began spending hours in the gardens, not supervising but working alongside Morwin, tending to the night-blooming jasmine and the heavy-headed magnolias. At first, Elias approved. He thought the physical activity might be good for her melancholy humors, as the doctor had called them. But the connection between the two women was unnerving. They communicated not with words but with a language of gestures, shared glances, and a silence that felt more intimate than any conversation. Seraphina's personal maid, a young girl named Celeste, grew resentful and fearful. She reported to Elias that the mistress was now refusing her help, preferring Morwen to assist her with dressing, bathing, and brushing her long hair. Elias found this peculiar. It was a breach of protocol, a disruption of the established order. A field hand, even one brought into the house, did not supplant a personal maid. He questioned Seraphina, but her answers were vague and dismissive. She claimed Morwen had a calming presence. The explanation did not satisfy Elias. It only deepened the disquiet that had begun to fester in his mind. Morwen's past was a mystery. The slave trader had known little, only that she came from a failed sugar plantation in the Caribbean, and before that she had been captured in the kingdom of Dahomey. She was a warrior, he had boasted, from a land where women fought as soldiers. Elias had bought her for her strength, intending to put her to work in the sugar mill, a place of brutal, relentless labor. But Seraphina had intervened. After seeing Morwen in the yard for the first time, she had gone to Elias and insisted the woman be assigned to the house. It was the first time in years she had made a direct, unwavering demand of him. Surprised by her forcefulness and perhaps hoping to placate her fragile psyche, he had agreed. Now he regretted it. Morwen moved through his house with an unnerving self-possession. She was obedient but not subservient. Her silence was not one of fear but of observation. She watched everything, her dark eyes missing no detail. The other house slaves gave her a wide berth, whispering about the strange markings on her face and the small, carved wooden figures she sometimes held in her massive hands when she thought no one was looking. They said she was a priestess, a witch who communed with spirits of the river and the swamp. They feared her, but Seraphina, it seemed, did not. The rituals began subtly. It started with the water. Seraphina, who had always bathed in water heated in the kitchen and scented with rose oil, began to insist on using cool water drawn directly from the rain cisterns, water that Morwen collected for her. Then came the herbs. Morwen would gather plants from the edge of the swamp, things the other slaves avoided, plants they called devil's root and blood vine. She would steep them in bowls of water left to sit under the full moon on Seraphina's private balcony. Elias found one such bowl, the water dark and smelling of damp earth and something else, something metallic and strange. When he confronted his wife, she claimed it was a folk remedy for her headaches, something Morwen had learned in her homeland. The explanation felt thin, rehearsed. His suspicion began to take a darker shape. He knew the stories whispered among the planters about the strange, heathen practices the slaves carried with them from Africa. He had always dismissed them as superstition, but now he felt a cold dread creep into his orderly world. He began to watch Seraphina, to track her movements, to listen at her door. The silence from her chambers was no longer empty. It was filled with a terrible, unspoken possibility. Elias' search for an heir had become a clinical obsession. He had brought 3 different doctors from New Orleans to examine Seraphina. They had prescribed laudanum for her nerves, iron tonics for her blood, and cold baths to shock her system into compliance. The final doctor had delicately suggested that the fault may not lie with Mrs. Vance. The implication hung in the air between them, an insult to Elias' virility and his very identity. He had dismissed the man in a cold fury. The failure had to be hers. It was a flaw in her design, a weakness in her constitution. Now, as he watched her secret communion with the giant slave woman, a new, horrifying thought began to form. Perhaps Seraphina had given up on medicine. Perhaps she had turned to something else entirely, to the dark, primitive magic that he both despised and feared. He started searching her rooms when she was in the garden. Tucked away in a locked hatbox, he found a small doll made of corn husks and bound with black thread. A single drop of what looked like dried blood was stained on its chest. The sight of it sent a jolt of ice through his veins. This was not a headache remedy. This was something forbidden, something that felt like a profound betrayal of their world, their faith, and their very race. The power dynamic on the plantation began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The other house slaves, who once answered only to Seraphina or Elias, now seemed to defer to Morwen. Her silent presence became an authority unto itself. A dropped tray, a poorly cooked meal, a dusty corner, all would be met with a slow, deliberate gaze from Morwen, and the mistake would not be repeated. She had, without a single command, become the true mistress of the household staff. Seraphina seemed to encourage it, abdicating her duties and retreating further into her private world with Morwen. They spent their afternoons in Seraphina's sewing room, but no sewing was ever done. The door was always closed. Once, the maid Celeste, driven by a mixture of curiosity and malice, peered through the keyhole. She told Elias later that she saw nothing but shadows, but she heard a sound, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language she did not recognize, a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. Elias felt his control slipping away, not just over his wife, but over the very heart of his home. His perfect, orderly kingdom was being infiltrated by a silent, creeping chaos, and its queen was the giant woman with the scarred face and the watchful eyes. Elias decided to separate them. It was the logical solution, the way to restore order. He would sell Morwen. The decision was made. He would send her to a trader in Natchez, far away, where she could never influence his wife again. That evening he informed Seraphina of his decision. He expected tears, pleading, perhaps a hysterical fit. Instead, she met his gaze with a cold, unsettling calm he had never seen in her before. She simply said, "If she goes, you will never have the son you desire." The words were not a threat but a statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. Elias was stunned into silence. She had admitted it. She had confessed in her own way to practicing some form of witchcraft. The audacity of it, the sheer, unholy rebellion, left him breathless. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a rage he could barely contain. Seraphina just smiled, a faint, mysterious curve of her lips. "We are correcting a mistake of nature," she replied, her eyes holding his. "God has not answered my prayers, so I have sought counsel elsewhere." It was a declaration of war, fought not on a battlefield but in the shadowed rooms of his own home. He did not sell Morwen. Seraphina's words had paralyzed him. His desire for an heir, the central obsession of his life, now warred with his need for absolute control. He was trapped. To get what he wanted most, he had to tolerate the one thing he could not abide, a power within his home that was not his own. He became a prisoner of his own ambition. His days were consumed by a tormenting vigilance. He watched them constantly. He saw Morwen lead Seraphina to the edge of the cypress swamp at dusk. He saw them returning hours later, their dresses stained with mud, their hair damp. He found strange symbols drawn in the dirt behind the smokehouse, intricate patterns that were washed away by the next rain. The plantation, his beautiful dream, was transforming into a landscape of his nightmares. The scent of jasmine and magnolia was now mixed with the smell of damp earth and decay. The nights were no longer silent. He imagined he could hear the faint, rhythmic chanting carrying on the humid air, a constant reminder of the unholy alliance that was unfolding under his own roof, an alliance that promised him his heart's desire at the cost of his soul. The nature of the rituals grew more intense, more disturbing. Elias, now sleeping in a separate room, would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds from his wife's chambers. He heard the splash of water, the murmur of her voice interwoven with Morwen's low, resonant chanting. One night, driven by a desperate need to know, he crept to her door and listened. He heard a sharp, hissing sound, followed by a soft cry from Seraphina, a sound not of pain, but of something akin to ecstasy. It was a sound he had never drawn from her. The jealousy that pierced him was sharp and hot, but it was tangled with a deeper fear. What was happening in that room? The next morning, as Seraphina passed him in the hall, he noticed a new mark on her wrist, a thin, red line, almost like a bracelet. When she saw him looking, she quickly covered it with her sleeve, her face a mask of serene indifference. The blood he had seen on the corn-husk doll now took on a terrifying new meaning. Blood was part of this. They were engaging in bloodletting, a practice he associated with the most savage, pagan rites. The woman he had married was a stranger to him, a willing participant in a dark covenant he could not begin to comprehend. The other slaves knew. They said nothing, their faces were as impassive as stone when Elias passed, but he could feel their knowledge in the way they averted their eyes, in the sudden silences that fell when he entered a room. They knew what their mistress was doing with the Dahomean woman. Perhaps they even approved. To them, Morwen was not just a slave. She was a vessel of the old power, the magic of the homeland that had been suppressed but never extinguished. Her influence was a quiet rebellion that they could all participate in through their silence. Elias felt utterly alone, an emperor in an empire that was secretly plotting against him. He tried to reassert his authority through cruelty. He ordered a field hand whipped for a minor infraction, forcing everyone to watch. He cut rations, hoping to breed fear and dependence. But his actions had the opposite effect. The slaves did not grow more fearful, they grew more silent, more unified in their secret defiance. They drew their strength from Morwen, from the knowledge that a power greater than their masters was now at work in the great house, a power that was slowly and methodically dismantling his world from the inside out. Seraphina began to change physically. A new vitality bloomed in her. The pale, listless woman was replaced by someone with a fire in her eyes and a flush in her cheeks. She moved with a newfound confidence, a sense of purpose that was both alluring and deeply unsettling to Elias. She was becoming more beautiful, more vibrant, but it was a beauty that seemed to be fed from a dark, hidden spring. She began to take an interest in the running of the plantation, not just the house, but the fields, the mill. She would ask Elias sharp, intelligent questions about crop yields and profit margins, questions she had never shown any interest in before. It was as if she were preparing for something, learning the mechanics of the kingdom she intended to co-rule. At night, he would see her and Morwen walking the grounds, their figures silhouetted against the moonlight, the tall, powerful form of the slave and the slender, elegant shape of the mistress, moving as one. They were no longer just two women. They were a single entity of purpose, and Elias was beginning to understand that the heir they were trying to create was not for him, but for them. The child would be the vessel of their combined power, a new dynasty born of blood, magic, and rebellion. The recurring symbol of their rituals was the water moccasin, the venomous snake that thrived in the murky waters of the swamp. Elias began finding traces of it everywhere. A shed snakeskin was placed on his pillow. A small, intricately carved wooden snake was left on the mantelpiece in his study. He knew it was a message, a threat from Morwen. In her culture, he learned from a book on African customs he had ordered from New Orleans. The snake was a powerful symbol of rebirth, fertility, and danger. It was a creature that could kill or, in the hands of a priestess, could be part of a potent medicine. They were taunting him, flaunting their forbidden knowledge in his face. He became paranoid, checking his boots for snakes before putting them on, starting at every rustle in the grass. The swamp, which he had always seen as a resource to be tamed and exploited, now felt like a living entity, an accomplice in the conspiracy against him. It was Morwen's domain, and she was slowly drawing its power into the very heart of his home, poisoning his world with its dark, ancient magic. Desperate, Elias sought help from an unlikely source. There was an old woman, a free woman of color named Mama Legba, who lived on the edge of the parish and was known as a traiteur, a folk healer who also dabbled in darker arts. The white planters publicly dismissed her as a charlatan, but privately many sought her out for charms and remedies they wouldn't admit to. Swallowing his pride and his prejudice, Elias rode to her shack deep in the bayou. He didn't give her his name, but she knew who he was. He described the situation vaguely, a foreign influence, strange rituals, blood magic. Mama Legba listened, her cloudy eyes fixed on him. When he was done, she cackled, a dry, rattling sound. "You have brought a queen into your house, monsieur," she said, "a Dahomean priestess. She is not making magic for your wife. She is making a new vessel for an old god. The child your wife carries will not be yours. It will belong to the serpent." The old woman's words confirmed his deepest fears. This was not just about an heir. It was about possession, about the creation of something monstrous. He left the shack in a cold sweat, the swamp's oppressive humidity feeling like a shroud. Armed with this terrifying new knowledge, Elias' vigilance turned into a hunt. He was no longer just a passive observer. He was actively searching for their sanctum, the place where the most potent rituals were performed. He knew it wasn't in the house. The risk of discovery was too great. It had to be somewhere hidden, somewhere on the vast grounds of the plantation where they could work their magic undisturbed. He began to explore the far corners of his property, places he hadn't been in years: an abandoned overseer's cabin near the swamp, a series of old, forgotten root cellars used for storing indigo a generation ago, the shadowy depths of the sugar mill after dark. He felt like a stranger on his own land, a trespasser in a world that was being reshaped by forces he couldn't control. The search became his sole focus. The sugar cane could rot in the fields for all he cared. His only purpose was to find their secret place and to witness the unspeakable act with his own eyes. Only then could he understand the true nature of the enemy he was fighting. Only then could he know how to destroy it. Seraphina was, by all indications, with child. The signs were subtle at first: a morning sickness she tried to hide, a new fullness in her figure. But by the 7th month of Morwen's arrival, it was undeniable. The news should have brought Elias joy, the culmination of a decade of desperate hope. Instead, it filled him with a profound and chilling horror. He felt no connection to the thing growing inside his wife. He did not see it as his child, his heir. He saw it as an invasion, a parasitic entity conceived through blood and dark magic, a vessel for a serpent god. He looked at his wife's swelling belly and felt not pride but revulsion. He continued to perform his duties as a husband, maintaining the public facade of a delighted father-to-be. He accepted the congratulations of his neighbors, hosted dinners where they toasted his coming heir, and played his part to perfection. But inside, he was a hollow man, animated only by his secret, obsessive hunt. The pregnancy had given his search a new, terrible urgency. He was not just trying to stop a ritual. He was racing against the birth of a monster. The maid, Celeste, became his unwilling spy. Terrified of Morwen but also desperate to regain her master's favor, she began to watch the two women with a renewed intensity. She followed them at a distance when they walked the grounds. She listened at the door not just at night but during the day. It was Celeste who finally gave him the clue he needed. She reported that once a week, on the night of the new moon, Morwen would go to the old smokehouse, a dilapidated building at the far edge of the slave quarters that was no longer in use. She would enter and not emerge for nearly an hour. After she left, Seraphina would make her way there, slipping out of the great house through a rear door. Celeste had never dared to get close enough to see what they did inside, but she was certain that this was their place, the old smokehouse. A place for curing meat, for preserving flesh through smoke and fire. The symbolism was not lost on Elias. It was the perfect altar for their profane religion. He now knew where to look. He would wait for the next new moon. The atmosphere at Belle Rêve grew thick with unspoken violence. Elias' temper, once carefully controlled, began to fray. He became prone to sudden, terrifying fits of rage, often directed at the slaves for the smallest of errors. A misplaced tool or a slow response could result in a brutal punishment. He was a man possessed, haunted by the serpent in his own home and in his own wife. Seraphina, in contrast, seemed to grow calmer as her pregnancy advanced. She moved with a serene, almost regal grace, as if she were already a queen mother. She and Morwen were inseparable, a tableau of light and shadow, fragility and strength. They were a self-contained unit, impervious to the storm raging within Elias. Their shared secret, their shared purpose, was a shield that his anger could not penetrate. This infuriated him more than anything. His wife was no longer his. His home was no longer his. His future, his very bloodline, was no longer his. He was a king who ruled over a kingdom of ghosts and shadows, and the only real power resided with the two women who were waiting in the smokehouse. On the night of the new moon, a thick, oppressive darkness settled over the plantation. The air was heavy and still, promising a storm. Elias waited in his study, a loaded pistol on his desk, the cold metal a small comfort in his trembling hands. He watched from his window as Morwen, a giant shadow among shadows, moved silently across the yard and disappeared into the crumbling smokehouse. An hour later, he saw a smaller, paler figure flit across the same path, Seraphina, cloaked and hooded. He gave them 10 minutes, letting them begin whatever final blasphemy they had planned. Then he picked up the pistol, his heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against his ribs. He stepped out into the night, the damp grass cool beneath his boots. The world was utterly silent, save for the frantic chirping of insects and the distant rumble of thunder. Each step toward the smokehouse felt like a step toward his own damnation. He was not just going to stop a ritual. He was going to confront the death of his world, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that not everyone would walk away from it. He approached the smokehouse like a hunter stalking his prey. The building was little more than a ruin, its cypress planks warped and blackened with age. A faint, flickering orange light emanated from the cracks in the walls, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the ground. A strange, sweet, smoky smell hung in the air, a scent of burning herbs and something else, something coppery and vital. Elias paused at the door, which hung crookedly on a single hinge. He could hear them now. A low, guttural chant from Morwen, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, and woven through it, Seraphina's voice, higher and clearer, repeating the same alien words. He drew the pistol, cocking the hammer. The click was unnervingly loud in the stillness. He took a deep breath, the foul, sweet smoke filling his lungs, and pushed the door open. The scene that met his eyes was a tableau from a madman's vision, a violation of every law of God and man that he had ever known. It was, in a word, unspeakable. The interior of the smokehouse had been transformed into a crude temple. The floor was covered in complex symbols drawn in what looked like white ash. In the center, a small fire burned in a clay basin, casting the room in a hellish, flickering glow. Seraphina was kneeling before the fire, her fine silk nightgown undone, her swollen belly exposed to the heat. Her eyes were closed, her face tilted upwards in a state of rapturous trance as she chanted. Standing behind her was Morwen. The giant woman was stripped to the waist, her powerful torso gleaming with sweat and oil. In one hand she held a live water moccasin, its head pinned securely in her grip, its body writhing. In the other she held a small, sharp obsidian knife. As Elias watched, frozen in the doorway, Morwen made a shallow, precise cut on Seraphina's exposed stomach, a thin line of blood welling up. Then, with terrifying speed, she did the same to the snake, and began to mix their bloods together on his wife's skin, chanting louder, her voice rising in a terrifying crescendo. This was the unspeakable act, a profane baptism, a ritual to bind the child in the womb not to the Vance bloodline, but to the serpent god of the swamp. The spell was broken by the sound of Elias' choked gasp. 2 pairs of eyes snapped towards him. Seraphina's were wide with a mixture of fear and ecstatic defiance. Morwen's were cold, ancient, and filled with a terrifying, absolute calm. She showed no surprise, no fear. It was as if she had been expecting him all along. The snake in her hand thrashed, and with a flick of her wrist, she threw it. The reptile landed on the dirt floor and slithered instantly into the shadows. Elias barely noticed. His entire focus was on the scene before him, his pregnant wife, anointed with blood, kneeling before a pagan fire guarded by a half-naked heathen priestess. The pistol in his hand felt heavy, righteous. "Witch," he hissed, the word tearing from his throat. He raised the gun, his aim settling on Morwen's chest. This was the source of the corruption, the serpent's head. Cut it off and the body would die. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Seraphina moved. She threw herself in front of Morwen, her arms spread wide, shielding the giant woman with her own body. "No," she screamed, her voice filled with a desperate, protective fury. "You will not harm her. She is the mother of your son." Her words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. "The mother of my son," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked at his wife, standing protectively before her accomplice, her belly smeared with blood, and he finally understood the true depth of the betrayal. It wasn't just about magic. It was about replacement. Morwen hadn't just been a conduit for a ritual, she had been the source of the child's spiritual lineage. This child, his supposed heir, was being born into Morwen's world under her god by her power. In the twisted logic of their covenant, Morwen was its true mother. He had been made a fool, a cuckold not of the flesh but of the soul. His entire legacy, the dynasty he had obsessed over, was being stolen from him, redirected into a bloodline of serpents and swamp magic. The rage that had been simmering for months erupted, a volcanic, blinding fury that consumed all reason, all thought. He saw only the two of them, the pale wife and the dark priestess, a monstrous matriarchy that had to be annihilated. The gun fired. The sound was deafening in the small space, a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the old building. When the smoke cleared, Seraphina was on the ground, clutching her shoulder, a dark stain spreading across the white silk of her nightgown. She had moved at the last second, and the bullet intended for Morwen's heart had struck her instead. Morwen did not hesitate. As Elias stood, momentarily stunned by his own action, she lunged. She moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a woman of her size. She did not reach for the gun. She went for him. Her massive hands closed around his throat, lifting him from his feet as if he were a child. His pistol clattered to the floor. He clawed at her arms, but it was like clawing at stone. His vision began to swim, black spots dancing before his eyes. He could feel his life being squeezed out of him, his orderly world collapsing into a single point of suffocating darkness. Through the roaring in his ears, he could hear Seraphina screaming his name, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He was dying. In the heart of his own kingdom, at the hands of a slave, he was being extinguished. But then, as his consciousness faded, the pressure on his throat was released. He fell to the floor, gasping, choking, the raw air burning his lungs. He looked up to see Seraphina, her face pale and streaked with tears and dirt, clinging to Morwen's arm. "Not like this," she was pleading in a desperate whisper. "Don't kill him, it will ruin everything. The child needs a father, the world needs a father." Her words were pragmatic, chillingly so. She wasn't saving her husband out of love. She was saving him as a necessary component of her plan. They needed him alive to give the child a name, a legitimacy, an inheritance. He was a tool, a puppet to be used and controlled. Morwen looked down at him, her eyes filled with a contempt so profound it was almost serene. She had spared him not out of mercy, but out of strategy. She nudged the pistol with her foot, sending it skittering into a dark corner. The power dynamic, which had been shifting for months, had now been irrevocably and violently settled. Elias Vance, the master of Belle Rêve, was now a prisoner in his own home, his life held in the hands of the two women he had tried to destroy. The knowledge was a fate worse than death. The reign of the serpent had officially begun. The aftermath was a silent, terrifying charade. Morwen, who possessed a deep knowledge of herbal medicine, treated Seraphina's gunshot wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through the fleshy part of her shoulder. It was painful, but not life-threatening. Elias was confined to his study, locked in from the outside. The official story told to the house slaves and any visitors was that there had been a terrible accident. A pistol had misfired while being cleaned, and the master in his grief and shock had taken to his room. Seraphina was recovering. The lie was flimsy, but no one dared to question it. The household was now run entirely by Morwen. She issued commands with quiet authority, and they were obeyed without question. She managed the kitchens, the cleaning, the grounds. She was in every sense the mistress of the plantation. Elias, listening from behind his locked door, heard the rhythms of his home being rewritten, his authority erased. He was a ghost in his own life, a powerless spectator to his own downfall. He had food brought to him, but he barely ate. He spent his days staring at the wall, the events of the smokehouse playing over and over in his mind, a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. 2 months later, Seraphina went into labor. It was a difficult birth, attended only by Morwen. The sounds from the master bedroom echoed through the silent house for hours, Seraphina's cries of pain and Morwen's low, steady chanting, a constant, rhythmic undercurrent. Elias heard it all from his prison, each cry a turn of the screw in his torment. At dawn, a new sound joined the others, the cry of a newborn infant, a son. Later that day, the door to his study was unlocked. Morwen stood there, her face impassive. In her arms, wrapped in a fine linen blanket, was the child. She held him out to Elias. He recoiled at first, but she did not move, her gaze commanding. Hesitantly, he took the baby. He looked down at the infant's face, searching for some sign of himself, some trace of the Vance lineage. The child was pale, with a fuzz of dark hair. He looked like any other newborn, but as Elias looked into the baby's eyes, they opened, and he felt a profound, primal chill. The eyes were not the blue of his own, nor the hazel of Seraphina's. They were a deep, dark, unnerving black, the same ancient, watchful black as Morwen's. Life at Belle Rêve settled into a new, grotesque kind of normalcy. Elias was released from his study, but his freedom was an illusion. He was a king in name only. Seraphina, now fully recovered, doted on the child whom they named Alistair, but she was a changed woman. The last vestiges of her former fragility were gone, replaced by a hard, cool confidence. She and Morwin raised the boy together, a united front of maternal authority. Elias was expected to play the part of the proud father, to hold the child for visitors, to speak of him as the future of the Vance line. And he did it. He played his part perfectly because he was terrified. He was a hostage, his life dependent on his compliance. He lived in constant fear of Morwen, of the silent, knowing look she gave him, of the power she held over his wife, his son, and his life. He was trapped in the beautiful dream he had built, which had become his personal, inescapable hell. The serpent was not in the swamp anymore. It was coiled in his own nursery, sleeping in his own cradle. The boy, Alistair, was a strange child. He was quiet, unnervingly so, and possessed the same watchful, observant nature as Morwen. He rarely cried. He would spend hours staring at the patterns of light on the floor or at the swaying Spanish moss outside the window. He showed an unusual affinity for the outdoors, for the swamp. As soon as he could walk, he would toddle towards the edge of the property, as if drawn by an invisible pull. Morwen was his constant companion, his shadow. She taught him things that Elias could only guess at, the names of the swamp plants, the calls of the night birds, the stories of her gods. She would carve him small wooden animals, always snakes, which he would clutch in his small fist. Seraphina encouraged this bond, seeing it as the continuation of the child's true education. Elias watched this transfer of knowledge, this spiritual inheritance, with a growing sense of dread. The child was not his. He was Morwen's creation, in mind and spirit, and he was growing stronger, stranger, every day. Belle Rêve was no longer a Vance plantation. It was becoming the first temple of a new and terrible world. As the years passed, the legend of Belle Rêve began to change in the parish. It was no longer known for its efficiency or the quality of its sugar, but for its strangeness, its isolation. The Vances rarely entertained anymore. Seraphina was seen in town only occasionally, and she seemed distant, otherworldly. Elias was a shell of the man he once was, aged beyond his years, his eyes holding a haunted, defeated look. The plantation itself seemed to be succumbing to the swamp. Vines crept up the white columns of the great house, and the once perfect gardens grew wild and untamed. Rumors circulated among the other planters and their wives. They whispered of madness, of a wife who had gone native, of a husband who had lost control. But no one knew the truth. The facade, however cracked, held. The unspeakable secret remained locked within the decaying grandeur of the plantation, a quiet, festering rot at the heart of the beautiful dream. The balance of power had been permanently inverted, a silent revolution that had succeeded completely. When Alistair was 7 years old, a fever swept through the parish. It took the young and the old, the master and the slave, without discrimination. It came to Belle Rêve. The boy fell ill, his body burning with a heat that no medicine, traditional or folk, could cool. Seraphina was frantic, but Morwen remained calm. She took the boy from his bed and carried him out into the night, towards the swamp, towards the old smokehouse. Elias, old and broken but still watching, followed them. He saw them through the cracks in the wall. He saw Morwen perform another ritual, this time not of birth but of preservation. She anointed the boy with river water and herbs, chanting the ancient words, calling upon her serpent god to spare its chosen vessel. This time there was no violence, no confrontation. Elias simply watched, a silent, hollow witness to a power he could never defeat. The next morning, Alistair's fever was gone. He was weak, but he would live. The god had answered its priestess. The child was protected. Elias finally accepted his defeat. He was nothing. His lineage, his name, his god, they were all meaningless echoes in a world that now belonged to the serpent. Elias Vance died 2 years later in the winter of 1857. He passed in his sleep, a quiet, unremarkable end for a man whose life had been consumed by such a spectacular, secret horror. He was buried in the family plot, his tombstone lauding him as a beloved husband and father, a pillar of the community. Seraphina, dressed in black, stood at his grave, her face a perfect mask of widow's grief. Beside her stood Morwen, and holding both their hands was the young Alistair, the new master of Belle Rêve. After Elias' death, Seraphina and Morwen ran the plantation openly as partners. The pretense was gone. They were two queens ruling their domain with a young prince as their heir. The Civil War came and went, but it barely touched their isolated world. When emancipation was declared, Morwen formally freed all the slaves at Belle Rêve. Many chose to stay, working the land for wages, loyal not to the memory of their master but to the woman who had quietly held power for so long. They had traded one ruler for another, but this one was their own. Belle Rêve became something else entirely, a community, a sanctuary, a place outside the bounds of the new world being forged around it. The historical record of Belle Rêve largely ends there. The Vance line continued through Alistair, but it was a strange, insular family that kept to itself, intermarrying with other free people of color in the region. The great house eventually fell into ruin, and the land was sold off in parcels in the early 20th century. The story of what truly happened between Elias, Seraphina, and Morwen faded into the realm of local legend, a ghost story about a mad planter's wife and her giant slave companion who practiced voodoo in the swamp. But in 1972, during the dredging of a canal near the old plantation site, workers uncovered a collection of objects preserved in the mud. Among them were dozens of small, intricately carved wooden figures, almost all of them depicting a serpent. And with them, a single, small obsidian knife, its edge still sharp enough to draw blood. The past is never truly erased. It just sinks into the soil, waiting for the right moment to be brought back into the light. If you want more dark historical stories like this, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America and keep the past from being erased.